This presentation is brought to you by the Montana Renewable Energy Association, whose mission is to foster the growth of renewable energy for all Montanans through education, advocacy, and industry engagement. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited for our topic today. We're going to be diving into energy subsidies, and these are kind of a largely politically charged issue that always comes up when you talk about energy development, regardless of the type of energy, whether it be coal or natural gas or solar or wind or batteries. There's kind of a lot to it, and there's a lot, I think, hidden behind the scenes that have to do with energy subsidies that we hope to bring out a little bit today. So I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Rich Reddy. Rich, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and we'll invite you to share yours. Rich is a professor of economics at Montana State University and a fellow at the Montana Institute on Economics. On ecosystems. Prior coming to MSU, he was a faculty member at the University of Kentucky, the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and Penn State University, and was an economist at the Department of the Interior. His research focuses on how individual decisions affect and are affected by natural resources and the environment. So Rich, thank you again so much for joining us and presenting today, and I'll leave it to you to take it away.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. I want to stress before I start that climate change is an area that I work in, but I'm by no means an expert on, for example, tax treatment of oil and gas wells, or these kinds of some of the specific policies I'll be mentioning. But I hope I can give you an overview of some of the issues, and so that kind of help give you some sort of a framework to keep in your mind. Let's see. There we go. Since we don't have much time, I won't be going too much into depth about individual policies. Instead, I want to give an overview of how to think about fossil fuel subsidies. First, I want to highlight how difficult it is to define what is a subsidy and point out that reasonable people can define them in different ways and end up with different estimates of how large they are. Then I want to talk about explicit subsidies. Those are the subsidies where we can see money changing hands or not changing hands in the case of tax breaks, for example. Then I want to talk about implicit subsidies. Those are the costs that fossil fuel producers and consumers are imposing on society that they do not have to pay. And finally, I want to discuss a couple of situations that I call loophole subsidies, where fossil fuel producers are able to use loopholes in the laws to lower their costs. Along the way, I'll provide some estimates of the magnitudes of these subsidies, focusing primarily on the US. I should point out that the dollar figures that I give are measured prior to the recent run-up in energy costs, so they might be a little out of date already. All right, so first question, what is a subsidy? There are a lot of different ways, different definitions floating around, and I picked this one because I thought it was pretty clear. The basic idea is that a subsidy is an intervention by the government that encourages higher production and consumption of fossil fuels by making it more profitable to produce them or cheaper to consume them. So production subsidies lower the cost of production. This can be through direct grants, loan guarantees, or tax breaks, for example. Or the government might provide or subsidize infrastructure to support the industry. These are the types of subsidies that are most common in higher income countries like the US. Price supports or price guarantees or direct payments from the government to producers based on production are not common for fossil fuels, at least not in the US. So this second category, we won't pay as much attention to. These are more common for things like agricultural commodities. There are some examples in renewable energy, and I think we'll hear later about this, for example, the production tax credit for wind and solar. Consumption subsidies are more common in lower income countries. So these are actions by the government to make energy cheaper from fossil fuels. For example, in many developing countries, gasoline prices are kept artificially low. So right now, gasoline sells for 20 cents a gallon in Iran and 9 cents a gallon in Venezuela. Now, these subsidies are large on a global scale, much larger than the production subsidies. There aren't many consumption subsidies in the US for fossil fuels, though you could say that low-income heating assistance programs would fall into this category, and those can be substantial. The budgetary costs of the LIHEAP program, that's a low-income heating assistance program, is expected to be over $8 billion in 2022. And that figure's a little bit high because heating costs are high right now. So focusing now on explicit production subsidies, these are kind of the most important piece we want to focus on in the US of the explicit subsidies. I'm going to start by talking about those. These are the subsidies that are explicitly written into law where you can actually see the money. In some cases, they're fairly easy to measure. So grants and tax credits are perhaps the easiest to measure because they involve direct payments by the government to producers or tax credits that can be seen on tax returns. So for example, the recently passed infrastructure bill has $2.3 billion of federal spending for carbon capture technology. That's money that the federal government is spending. And other examples, producers that capture and sequester carbon from fossil fuels can get a tax credit of up to $35 per ton. So those tax credits currently cost the US government about $200 million a year, but they're expected to increase over time. So these are subsidies that are fairly easy to measure because we can track how much is given in grants or tax credits. It's much harder to measure how much is being given away in preferential tax treatment because it's hard to identify the right baseline against which we compare. So to illustrate this, consider the tax treatment of the costs of finding and obtaining the rights to and developing a fossil fuel asset like an oil well. Those costs can be deducted from income when calculating profit, but there's a principle in taxation that because an oil well is an asset that lasts for many years, the costs of developing an oil well should be capitalized. They should not all be deducted in the year they're spent. Instead, they should be put on the books and deducted over the period when the resource is being produced. We say that the cost should be depreciated over the life of the well. Now, the principle is fairly straightforward, but it's not always followed. So in the case of wells, about 30% of the costs of drilling a well are so-called tangible costs. They involve investment in machines and equipment that remain when the well's put into production. Now, these costs have to be capitalized and depreciated over 7 years. Now, why 7 years? Because that's about how long we expect equipment to last. The other 70% of costs are intangible. They include labor, fuel, hauling, site preparation, other expenses that do not leave behind a tangible asset. Now, these can be deducted from profits in the year that they're spent. They don't have to be spread out over 7 years. Now, being able to deduct those intangible costs right away is better for the production company. They actually end up saving money on their taxes. So in 2017, the Joint Committee on Taxation estimated that if you treat intangible costs the same way you treat tangible costs, you would generate about $1.7 billion more in tax revenues per year. So is that a subsidy? Should the intangible costs be capitalized and depreciated, or should the wages you pay to a roughneck on a drilling rig be treated the same way as the wages you pay a janitor at your corporate headquarters? And other questions, is 7 years the right time horizon for depreciation? The point I'm trying to make is that there's no right answers to these questions. Reasonable people can argue different ways. And these are the rabbit holes you have to go down if you want to try to measure the subsidies that are being given to fossil fuels. Now, other situations are a little more straightforward. So for example, there's a provision that makes depreciating the capitalized costs of a well more attractive. Ideally, you would allow the capitalized cost of developing a well to be deducted as the well is depleted. So if you pump 10% of the oil from a reserve in a year, you would deduct 10% of the capital costs. But for many oil wells, each year you get to deduct 15% of the value of the oil produced. Now, that deduction is not tied to the money you actually spent to develop the well. Over the life of the well, you can easily deduct more than the capital costs of drilling the well, particularly if energy prices are high. That's clearly a subsidy. And the Joint Committee on Taxation estimated that this subsidy costs the US government about $1.3 billion per year. So I'm not going to go through every special tax rule regarding fossil fuel production in the US. There are a lot of them, they're complicated, and it's not always easy to say what the right tax treatment would be absent the subsidy. So it's difficult to estimate how large the subsidies actually are. Another potential for subsidies is when the federal government sells leases for fossil fuel production on federal lands on the outer continental shelf. The concern is that the government's not getting a fair price for these leases. Here again, it can be difficult to establish what the right price should be. So for example, federal oil leases charge a 12.5% royalty rate. 12.5% of the value of the oil produced is paid to the government as it is produced. That's lower than the royalty rate charged by states. So is that a subsidy? What is the quote unquote right royalty rate? It's not clear. Other situations are more clear. So for example, when the government reduces the royalty rate for a mine that's becoming economically unviable, we can clearly see that there's a subsidy going on there. So hopefully you've gotten the impression that it's difficult to measure the total size of fossil fuel subsidies. It depends so much on how you define the baseline against which you're comparing things. However, people have tried. So I'm presenting here a widely cited estimate of the total explicit production subsidies to fossil fuels in the US. This includes both state and federal subsidies. Now, to put these numbers into perspective, is about 15% of the total value of fossil fuel production. And that ratio is pretty similar for coal versus oil and gas. All right, so I'll give you some idea of kind of the magnitude of the subsidies we're providing. Next, I want to talk about implicit subsidies. So when you produce and transport and consume fossil fuels, that results in costs to society that are not paid by the producers or the consumers of those fuels. Economists call these external costs. Now, these costs include damages from climate change, health impacts, primarily from air pollution, and costs associated with car and truck use from gasoline and diesel use. Now, I should point out that that last category is somewhat controversial, whether it should be included. An electric vehicle would also cause traffic congestion and accident risk when it's used. So it's not entirely clear that we should account for vehicle miles traveled using fossil fuels versus those traveled powered by cleaner energy sources. How should we treat those? The best study that I could find that tried to estimate the external costs from fossil fuels produced in the US was by Kotchin. Now, he found that the total implicit subsidy from unpriced external costs is about $600 billion a year. Those costs vary depending on which fuel you're talking about. So the coal subsidies are dominated by local air pollution effects. Natural gas subsidies are dominated by climate change effects. And gasoline and diesel are dominated by traffic effects, congestion, road accidents, and road wear. Now, even if you decide that those transportation-related impacts are not fossil fuel specific and take them out, the total subsidy is still more than $350 billion per year. So any way you slice it, the implicit subsidies to US fossil fuel producers from not pricing those external costs are at least 2.5 times as large as the total market value of the fossil fuels. Globally, you may have seen an estimate from the International Monetary Fund that the worldwide fossil fuel subsidies total $5.9 trillion per year, or about 7% of world GDP. Now, almost all of that total is implicit subsidies from unpriced environmental damage. Finally, there's some situations where fossil fuel producers can use loopholes to avoid paying costs that the law intended that they pay. Now, I'm just going to highlight two examples. The first has mostly been closed already. So when coal is produced from a federal lease, the mining company has to pay the government a royalty equal to a fixed percentage of the value of the coal. But how is that value measured? Coal companies were using a trick where they would sell the coal to a subsidiary of the same company at a reduced price, setting a low price for the royalty. Then the subsidiary would sell the coal to an external company at a higher market price. Now, during the Obama administration, the rules were changed so that the value was set by the first arm's length sale. There was a lot of pushback about that rule from the coal companies who claimed that forcing them to pay royalties based on fair market value was part of the quote unquote war on coal. Now, the second loophole I want to talk about is still wide open, and I think it isn't getting enough attention. When a natural gas producing company finishes producing a well, it's required to plug the well so that it doesn't continue to leak methane. Now, that costs money. Now, gas companies have figured out that they can sell the well when it's nearing the end of its life to a smaller company. The small company keeps the well going for a while, producing some gas. And then at the end of the well's life, the small company then just disappears. It dissolves itself and declares bankruptcy. There's no longer a company that with money to pay to plug the well, and the well stays unplugged. In this way, the initial company that drills the well can avoid paying to plug it. Now, as an example, there's a company called Diversified Energy that has at least 3,000 wells that have stopped producing, but that it hasn't capped. Diversified has been paying out its profits as dividends, so it doesn't have the $75 million it would take to cap those wells. Now, the state regulators are now worried that if they go to Diversified and force them to cap all the wells, Diversified will go out of business. And Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia will be left with over $1 billion in capping costs for those wells and for the other wells that Diversified owns. So they let Diversified continue to operate and they're slowly capping a few of the wells each year. Meanwhile, the uncapped wells continue to leak methane. Now, there are obvious ways to solve this problem. The company that drills the well could be required to post a closure bond that contains enough money to cap the well, or we could make all companies that ever own the well separably liable for capping costs. But production companies would no doubt push back on those changes. So those are just two examples of how companies find loopholes in the regulations to reduce their costs. And those are a type of subsidy that doesn't get counted in the estimates that I gave earlier. There we go. So to kind of wrap up, here's some of the main ideas that I hope you take home from this. First, it can be hard to unambiguously identify and measure subsidies. Second, in developed countries, production subsidies tend to be the more important, while in developing countries, consumption subsidies are more important. Third, implicit subsidies are much larger than explicit subsidies and should be receiving much more attention in policy discussions. Finally, the lawyers and accountants at fossil fuel companies are clever, and we need to always be adjusting the rules to avoid unintended subsidies and the adverse environmental outcomes that go along with them. So I'll stop there. I hope we have time later for Q&A. If not, I've got my email address there, and you're welcome to contact me with any questions or thoughts that you might have. So I will then stop sharing and hand it back.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rich. That was incredibly informative and really interesting. So I appreciate you joining us again today. I'm going to go ahead and get our next speaker's slide deck booted up here. And Rich, would you give me a thumbs up and make sure that you can see my slide deck? Got a thumbs up. That's great. Okay. And let's see. I will introduce Robin Arnold. Robin is the Markets and Transmission Director at Renewable Northwest, a nonprofit that engages in state-level policy and regulatory filings to accelerate decarbonization in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana by accelerating the transition to renewable energy. At Renewable Northwest, Robin works on issues including expansion of regional markets in the West and BPA transmission. Previously, she worked as a policy analyst for the Montana Public Service Commission. So let's see, Robin, I believe I need to ask you to unmute here to make sure that we can hear you.
All right, Andrew, can you hear me?
I can. Go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Great. So when you talk about subsidies for the renewable sector, it's generally much more explicit. People are generally referring to either the investment tax credit or the production tax credit. So that's what I'll be covering in my slides today. Next slide, please. And we can skip this because Andrew already went over it. So next slide, please.
Go ahead.
So the investment tax, can you still hear me?
Yep, sorry, you're good.
All right, the investment tax credit is a tax credit equal to a percentage of total cost to install a project, including equipment, labor, and permitting fees. The ITC currently applies to solar energy storage charged by solar and offshore wind. Next slide. The ITC for solar was first passed by Congress in 2006. It began at 30% of total project cost and was stepped down to 26% in 2019. It was originally slated to step down to 22% in 2021. However, it's been extended twice now, so the step down date is not until 2023. And after that, it will step down to a permanent 10% value after 2025. The energy storage ITC applies to storage projects that are charged by at least 75% by solar, and it's the same amount of the credit is the same percentage as the solar ITC. Next slide, please. Congress also recently passed a 30% ITC for offshore wind projects. These projects will need to begin construction by 2025. And then the ITC also exists for geothermal, small wind, and microturbines. And I'll also note that there is an ITC for residential solar as well, but I'm mostly focused on utility scale projects in this presentation. Next slide, please. So there have been efforts to extend the ITC. The Build Back Better bill included several energy provisions, including extension of these tax credits. It would have done the following. It would have maintained a 30% solar ITC through 2031, followed by step downs along with labor standards for commercial solar projects, which don't currently exist. It also had a 30% standalone storage ITC through 2031, so it would not need to be tied to solar resources, and up to a 30% transmission ITC based on compliance with labor standards. It also would have been direct pay, so these projects would not have to wait to file taxes to receive the credit. The Build Back Better bill basically died as an entire package. However, there are still efforts to bring back just the energy component of that bill. I think the hopes of that actually passing are growing dimmer by the month, but there are definitely still negotiations going around regarding this bill. Next slide, please. So the production tax credit, or PTC, is typically associated with utility scale wind projects. It was first enacted by Congress in 1992, and it's equal to a 10-year fixed dollar per kilowatt hour for energy produced by an eligible facility. Wind projects can receive the PTC based on either the year that the project begins operation or the year in which 5% of the total capital cost for the project has been spent and construction has begun, with construction completed within 4 years. And I'll note most projects that I'm familiar with usually opt for the construction beginning option where they need the 5% of the total capital cost. Next slide, please. So the base rate is an inflation adjusted 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour in 1993 dollars, which the IRS will publish an update for every year to note what the inflation increase is. As of May 2022, this was equivalent to 2.6 cents per kilowatt hour. The PTC rate has increased and decreased based on phase-out schedules and subsequent extensions. The extensions usually don't make it through Congress in time to be continuous, so you'll see both a ratcheting up and a ratcheting down. It started at 100% in 2016, decreased to 40% in 2019, and has increased back again to 60% in 2020 and 2021. Next slide, please. So also a note on the production tax credit, the Build Back Better bill would have extended this as well. It would have extended it to 2027 before step downs began. Do away with the production tax credit and just have an ITC for utility scale wind instead. Next slide, please. So in addition to the federal subsidies, there are some state tax incentives. No statewide tax incentives currently exist in Montana for utility scale renewables. However, in other states such as Oregon, they do allow a payment in lieu of taxes, and they have other community related tax incentives where in exchange for pausing their property taxes for a certain number of years, they would instead pay a percentage of what they would have been taxed to the communities instead. Montana does have an option for counties to elect to grant a property tax abatement for new or expanding industry, which also includes wind and solar. The county has the option to allow to tax the project at either 25% or 50% of the taxable value for the first 5 years after construction begins. And then that tax would incrementally increase until it's 100% by the 10th year. Next slide, please. So property taxes can also influence whether or not a project is more interested in building in one state over another. The utility scale solar in Montana is currently taxed at 6%, which is the same amount as hydro and coal are taxed in Montana. However, it's also one of the highest tax rates for solar in the region. I'll note that Idaho, our neighbor, only taxes solar at 3%, which is a much lower tax rate than what Montana taxes solar at. Wind, energy storage, and transmission infrastructure, however, are in a separate tax class, and they're taxed at 3%, which, while this mostly applies to renewable sources, somehow natural gas combined cycle units are also included in this lower tax bracket at 3%. Next slide, please. I think that might be it. Yep. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and hopefully we left plenty of time for everybody.
Thank you so much, Robin. Again, very informative, and appreciate you taking the time to share with us. I'm trying to get my slide deck back up and running here. So with that, we will turn to questions. So once again, you can go ahead and submit your questions using the chat function, and I will pass them along to our speakers. I had one maybe just to kick things off while people are thinking and submitting their questions for our speakers here. I guess I wanted to start with Rich and maybe have you kind of address this first. Have you come across, and Robin as well, of course, but have you come across how important these subsidies are? I mean, you know, obviously as a developer, you're building financial models based on the subsidies, but you know, I think what we hear a lot when we talk about policy changes are some of these subsidies going away, some of the percentages changing and things like that. I mean, is it all pretty doom and gloom? You know, if these things change, is the industry going to flop? Can you comment on that a little bit?
Well, I'll start. I'm sure that Robin has some ideas on the renewable side. I think that the answer depends a lot on which fuel you're talking about. So, I mean, the subsidies are obviously important, and I'm talking mostly here about the production subsidies for fossil fuels. And it depends a little bit on kind of the margins. So if we're talking about subsidies for oil, for example, if the subsidies are somewhere around 15% of the value of the oil, if we did away with those subsidies, you wouldn't see a huge change in the amount of oil activity that's going on. But if you did away with the subsidies for coal, where the margins are much slimmer, that would be a much bigger impact. Coal is already kind of economically disadvantaged relative to renewables and natural gas. So any change in the economics there is going to have a much bigger impact. So now that's just kind of focusing on the explicit production subsidies. The implicit subsidies, it has the potential to be a much bigger. If we were to start charging fossil fuel producers the costs associated with burning the fossil fuels in some sort of carbon tax, that would have a much bigger impact, and it would and again, the impact would vary by the fuel. The impact would be pretty much total loss of the coal sector, but a much smaller impact on oil, and natural gas would probably be somewhere in between. So again, the kind of the main point being it varies a lot depending on which part of the fossil fuel sector you're talking about. Robin could probably talk more, but I know that on the renewable side, there's the tax credits, the production tax credit and the investment tax credits for wind. The amount of wind that's installed in every year is very sensitive to whether those things have expired or been reinstated or something like that. So, but I'll let Robin talk more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Robin, do you have any additional comments to add?
Yes, I'll add for solar and wind. I'd say it would change the landscape of development pretty dramatically. I think it would still be competitive without the subsidies because the costs for both wind and solar have been decreasing over the years to the point where I think they could still remain competitive. However, the margins to build projects have become so slim as everybody competes against each other that I think what you would see would happen is a lot of the smaller developers would be squeezed out of the market. And so you'd only see either utility-owned projects or some of the larger companies developing the projects.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So quite an impact, though, maybe kind of in different ways, like you both said, depending on what type of energy it is, how big your company is, and everything like that, which certainly makes a lot of sense. And Robin, since I have you unmuted still, one more question directed at you. For the PTC, the production tax credit, I'm always interested, we talk about these tax credits in terms of cents per kilowatt hour. I think it was 1.5 was the one for the PTC. For context, how does that compare to the energy value that developers get when they sell their energy? Maybe even just as a ballpark percentage. I'm always trying to understand, like, how that subsidy or credit relates to, the actual finance side of the, product that they're selling back into the market.
Sure. I'd say, I can't even give you a ballpark percentage-wise. I'd have to get back to you on that. But I would say overall, it's on the smaller side, especially compared to the costs for transmission and interconnection and everything else that these projects need to pay. But again, it can be very impactful as to whether or not one project can be competitive over another when they're bidding into a utilities RFP.
Sure, that makes sense. Great, well, thank you for that, Robin. We do have a question from one of our attendees today. This comes from Mark and is for Dr. Ruddy. Rich, can you speak to state level fossil fuel subsidies at all? For instance, in the last legislative session, there was a bill discussed in the Energy and Telecommunications Committee to either give a tax holiday or reduce taxes for small fossil fuel producers. And it did make it out of committee, though I don't know that the bill made it all the way through. Mark comments that one speaker from in support of the bill mentioned that they had a mom and pop business that they had to lay off 100 employees, which doesn't feel like, quote unquote, small in their book. So can you comment on state level kind of discussions a little bit?
You're getting a bit into the details more than I have expertise to talk about. So, clearly, I've seen some of the news reports about some of these tax holidays. And I'm afraid I'm not expert enough in the details on those kinds of things. I'm going to have to pass on that one.
Fair enough. Yeah, I know that the state level, I know from my own research and what I've come across is it's a little challenging when you start digging into the state level because there is such a patchwork of policies. The federal policies that we all know of, and particularly, working at MREA, I'm very familiar with the ITC and PTC that Robin talked about. But when you do get into state level policies, there's some high level themes, but the nuances are all incredibly different and certainly different state to state. So it can make it challenging to track them all, at least in my experience. Well, I don't see any other questions that have come in. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to give another thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Robin. And mention that, of course, we have another presentation coming up in July. We are confirming our topic right now, so I can't announce it today, but we hope to announce it in the next few days coming up here. And we encourage you to join us again on July 6th at noon. So once again, thank you, Rich, thank you, Robin, and thank you everybody for joining us.